Welcome to the podcast of the Public Education Foundation.
I'm Zhan Okuda-Lim with the Leadership Institute of Nevada. I'm here today with Matt Candler, who is the founder of 4.0 Schools in New Orleans. Matt, great to have you here today.
Zhan, good to be back with you.
So Matt, let's jump right into what you've been doing with our Teacher Leader Academy these past few days. Tell us a bit more about 4.0 Schools and the work that you've done the last couple of years in New Orleans.
Totally, yeah. So 4.0 it's good to be back. It's these 3 days are three of my favorite days of the year, partly because I just get to be in the room with other educators. And the work, 4.0 is the context for these sessions with the fellows. And at 4.0 today, it's evolved quite a bit. We can talk a little bit about how we've gotten where we are. But today, 4.0, I think is best described as a community of people all around the country who are curious enough about what the future of school could be, the future of learning could be, that they've decided to try something new. And so 4.0 has two fellowships that we provide to folks who are curious about testing new ideas. And there are a few things that we think are really important that everyone in that community is either has in common or is aspiring to. We're all on our own journeys. But what we aspire to is that we have curiosity as core to what we're doing. And we have listening as a fundamental precept about what the future of school could be. I think my inner teacher thinks that he's supposed to be the expert. And so one of the things that 4.0 I think is constantly trying to do is say, we need to bring students and community members into our conversations about where school could go in a way that we haven't in the past. So in the two fellowships that represent what 4.0 is to most people, we provide you an opportunity to tell us what your ideas about the future of school are, and then we give you coaching and cash and the community within which, through a cohort experience of folks that are going to go through that process with you. So to just be really specific, the Essentials Fellowship, it's worth about $5,000 to $6,000. Up to $1,000 of that is cash, and you apply to 4.0 with your idea of essentially like a pop-up version of your school or your learning space or something that you think will make school better. Mm-hmm. And you get enough support. Again, you come to a camp with about 30 other folks, and those are folks from all over the country thinking of all other types of ideas about making school better in their city. After that camp, you go home with a check for $300 and a plan in place in your other hand to go home, and within 8 weeks, ideally, you run a small experiment with folks in your own community, students, families, other teachers. And what you're trying to create in that space is, hey, let's just start this conversation of what could represent a future better version. So that's what we do in the Essentials Fellowship. The Tiny Fellowship is that same idea, but extending that out to be maybe 6 months, maybe a semester.
Okay.
So again, both of these fellowships are designed to give people a place to try their ideas out with folks that they share community with and get feedback on those ideas. Mm-hmm. All of this is done, by the way, Zhan, without quitting your day job. So you have to find a way to squeeze your 3-day camp experience into your teaching schedule, and then you have to find a way to squeeze these experiments that you want to run into your schedule. And we find that like that challenge of doing this on the side actually makes the ideas better, because you have to keep it simple, you have to work fast, and you have to listen and iterate. And you can't go through it thinking, I want to build a 400-page detailed plan of what my future best school in the world could be. You have to go through that real struggle of saying, all right, I've got an hour. What would happen if I boiled down my idea of the best school I could ever do into 60 minutes with 5 kids? But that's what we try and do at 4.0.
But it also gets to that idea of teacher leaders remaining as teacher leaders, being in the classroom, being in the school, being with students, as opposed to being out of the classroom for too long. Right?
Yeah, I love that you raised that. I think we mentioned, we traffic in a lot of the verbs and frameworks of entrepreneurship. But if you unpack entrepreneurship in its form in the U.S. today, there's an association with having the courage to quit your job and, dedicate yourself to the idea that is, you in the garage making up Microsoft or Hewlett Packard or Zuckerberg, and Facebook. And those are stories of white men of privilege who, have the luxury and the opportunity to go, really dedicate themselves. But I think what we need is in education is folks who remain grounded and are connected to students and families on the daily basis, and that your journey should start, as you mentioned, without disconnecting, by staying engaged. And so much of what 4.0 has done as it's evolved is we have confronted the reality that when we started, we bought into this idea that 4.0, for our first fellowship, Zhan, you got a full year of salary. And we made you quit your job. And now, 1,000 fellows later, we make sure you don't quit your job. Because you just mentioned it. You have to be in proximity to the people that you want to work with. And, expertise, as it's typically manifest as someone who is distant, who has the sort of clinical ability to assess the situation from afar, we don't agree with that as a source of expertise. We think that proximity to and relationship with students and families is an absolute prerequisite to being, quote, an education entrepreneur, unquote.
And in a little bit, I'd love to chat more about your point about expertise and how 4.0 has evolved over the years. But before we get to that, would you share with our listeners some advice based on your work and the work of your fellows on what educators should keep in mind if they want to do these sorts of tiny tests or these small experiments in their classrooms, working with students and with families? What are like 2 or 3 key pieces of advice of how educators can do that?
Yeah, I grew up watching more movies than reading books, so I traffic in metaphors instead of like a deep vocabulary. But my favorite metaphor for how to navigate this challenge is to think about chefs. So let's think about a chef dreaming. They're slugging it out in, I'll just use Emerald. He's got a bunch of restaurants in New Orleans, and there are a bunch of chefs in New Orleans slugging it out, working on the line in Emerald's restaurants, and they have dreams of their own restaurants. Maybe it's the food that they grew up with, which is different than the food that Emerald grew up with. And they don't have a chance to explore that. They're like our teachers that we work with, many of the fellows who are stuck in the work they're doing today, but they have amazing ideas about food that folks may have never eaten before. So imagine the idea of, instead of them thinking, just going to work every day, going, when am I going to get my own restaurant? Think about the technology of the food truck as a way for them to actually make a step forward towards that vision with 100 times less money. Let's say it costs $1 million to do a restaurant. It's $10,000 to do a food truck. And you could go find a food truck for $10,000 and do it on the side. Now, that's way easier than restaurant, but still pretty hard for that chef to do and keep their day job.
Yeah.
So let's divide by $100 again. And now we're at the concept of a pop-up dinner. And so now that chef, all they have to do, instead of coming up with all the money and quitting their job and doing everything it takes to build a restaurant, all they have to do is distill that vision down into 3 dishes. And they need 4 or 5 people to come eat the food. And they need to borrow a restaurant from their friend who's closed on a Sunday night. And suddenly, with the technology, I'm using air quotes, of the pop-up meal at your disposal, now you keep your day job as a teacher, keeping those connections together, but now you can start thinking about experiments to run. So my advice to folks who get these, my inner teacher runs up against this wall all the time, I just challenge him, divide by 10. If you're like, okay, I can't think of the school, but I can think of a course that takes a semester. A semester is 50 days in the classroom, 75 days, divide by 10. Now I'm looking at 7 days. That's like a week, 2 weeks. That's still too much. Let's divide by 10 again. Now we're looking at 1 day. Can you do that in 2 or 3 weeks? No, that's going to take too much to get approval for that. Okay, cool. Divide by 10 again. 70 minutes.
Yeah, 1 class period.
Now we're talking, right?
Yeah.
And I dare you, like when you feel like you could do it, divide by 10 again. Now you're at 7 minutes. How long would it take for you to find 3 kids to do a 7-minute experiment? Is there any excuse between you and doing that in 2 weeks? I don't think so. And that's the practice that I think we're constantly pushing each other to do, is to simplify it enough to make all the excuses go away.
And that goes to a point of discussion in education policy and education practice, and that is the split between wanting to get a program going and scaling it quickly versus doing something small at first, piloting it in a small scale and seeing what works and how you can improve, right?
Yep.
So it's really cool to hear that perspective. And it's a way to think about it. Divide by 10, divide it down to something that's manageable, and then start from there.
And what happens when you do that, what you take out of the equation is the institution, but what you maintain is the humanity and the humans. And I think that's the trick, is get it small enough to where it's just you and a few other human beings that you want to learn with. And that's what is so powerful about this, is that we are all captive to the current institutions that we work within or in spite of.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do here is to maintain the humanity, the humans in this process of making school better, but get away from all of the yes buts and the excuses that are real, that many of us want to go away, that come from the institutional constraints.
Let's talk a bit about that, this human element, being in a community, working with your students and families and your colleagues. Earlier you mentioned how 4.0 has moved away from that idea of that distant expert. And the vision of 4.0 is to inspire educators to really be one with the students and the families and school communities they're in. Tell us a bit more about that journey, your journey through 4.0. I read your recent blog post where you describe over time how your views and the views of your colleagues have shifted through your work. Tell us a little bit more about that journey for you.
Yeah, I appreciate you raising it. I think, I'm on a journey from, I'll think I'll be on it till, I'm done. But I used to think of myself, there's still elements where I think that I'm the expert. I moved to New Orleans in 2006 as, I'm using air quotes, your listeners can't hear it, as a charter school expert. And there's no doubt that in my mind, I had this sense of arrogance and certainty and expertise that I could bring all of that to New Orleans and help the families of New Orleans. And, I think as a teacher, we all probably have elements of like, yes, I have knowledge to share. That's kind of part of what we do as educators, is we bring knowledge to children. But I have been unpacking that, not just in my own identity as a white man, as a man who grew up and went to private schools, a guy who grew up in the South. Part of this is me processing my own privilege and realizing that I come to the work, if I'm not interrogating where I'm coming to it from, with a sense of privilege and distance that makes me less effective, that makes me the wrong guy to be experimenting and to be inviting people in. And so the first version of 4.0, as I mentioned earlier, was predicated on the idea that you would come to 4.0, quit your job, be on board for a year, and you could learn from me and learn from all the other folks that I knew on how to start a charter school. And that's mostly what we're doing. And this is not me bashing charter schools. They're a powerful mechanism. But what I've learned over time is that, while we were running that program, there was a small experiment that one of my colleagues wanted to run with teachers in their classrooms. And he said, he and Katie Beck, who was the chief operating officer for 4.0, she and Brian said to me, hey, can we just run this experiment with teachers? Because they want to try new things, but they don't want to quit their job and start schools. Can we take some of these techniques and bring them to them?
Yeah.
And that experiment changed everything for 4.0. And because it forced me to put my expertise on the shelf. I could no longer rely on my 15 years of expertise as a school builder. I had to say, okay, I'm going to have to unbundle all this expertise and ask people, how can we help them? And that, I think, process of saying, I'm going to put my expertise on the side, and I'm just going to sort of move into the space and try and hear people out and hear what their experiments that they want to run are, that are smaller and not necessarily going to make me feel good about what I can teach them. over time, that whole process has kind of transformed again and again and again. And now we've got a community where I don't do any coaching. My staff doesn't do any coaching. Alumni do coaching. And so, we've started to essentially dismantle 4.0 in its format as a staff of experts who are there to help you. Our job is to just facilitate these conversations between the fellows who are doing all of these trials that we mentioned and alumni who've done those trials themselves in the last 6 to 18 months. And so the whole construct of 4.0 now becomes there's a community of people doing this in their communities. And if you work at 4.0, your job is to facilitate that. You don't deliver expertise. You are facilitators of that process amongst people who've already had the courage to do it and the people who are doing it right now.
In your work and your writings and in some of the work you're doing with our teacher leaders, you mentioned Lisa Delpit's work, other people's children. What has Delpit's work meant for you and your colleagues as part of this journey you've been on?
Yeah, Dr. Delpit means a lot to me because I read her book when I was an education major in college. And a few semesters after that, despite her book and a lot of other things that inspired me then, I stopped being an education major. So when I had my first teaching job, I went into a private school because I didn't have a certificate. But I did not really understand. I thought that was an inspiring book, but it was only, in my early 40s when I realized that, I very much had spent a lot of my career teaching other people's children in the sense that I wasn't doing things with students or families. I was doing things to them. I was doing education to them. And I think I'm continuing to kind of work that out in my own journey and to just interrogate where are you coming from as someone doing it to versus with. And this distance that we create as educators distant from families, educators distant from students, is a real conversation that we don't talk about much. It's animating a lot of the work that we're doing in the room across the hall. And it's just creating a space where we can say as educators, you're right, we do work to students. The concept of doing work with is not animating everything we do every day as educators. Some of that's just defense mechanisms, and we feel, that we have to protect ourselves, and we're being done to by the system. And I think that just oozes into how we do things to students and to families. And I mean, Dr. Talbot planted that seed 30 years ago for me that I'm still seeing the fruits of. And in that book and in her work, she challenges us to say, you cannot do education to other people's children. You have to aspire to do it with. And I think there's even another level, which is you have to aspire to folks thriving on their own, by themselves. That the goal is not to just do it with, but is to have schools and educators believe that our job is to let folks, wherever they're coming from poverty or wealth, that they are the agents of their own future, and that we're facilitating that in a way that it's like the continuum is from to with to by. And I think Dr. Delpit, I give her credit for just setting that in motion, that process of challenging the idea that we should just do this too.
And that, I think, leads to some of the work you've been doing the last year and a half on transition planning for 4.0. You mentioned earlier the journey that the organization's been on.
Right.
And you've recently handed off the baton to a new CEO.
Yep.
Tell us more about that process of transition and succession planning in an organization.
Yeah, and I think that to with by framework is the right way to engage on this topic. I think the same thing about being a CEO and a founder is that there's this distance between you and the people, not just on your staff, but also in the people that we're serving. Because our team is here to serve the people who are doing the real work of trying to create moments, learning moments in these pop-ups and pilots that then lead to a better future of school for everyone. And in interrogating that, I think we have 1,000 alumni now. And over the last 2 years, Hassan, he was our director of investments, and he's now our CEO. He pushed on this idea of to and with and by. And he led us into this current state where 20% of the money that 4.0 spends that isn't cash to fellows is to our alumni. And that's sort of our way of moving to this idea of we're working with our alumni, and now we're actually empowering them to. The 4.0 is not by the staff for the fellows, it's by the alumni for the fellows. And then, could we make it a by the fellows and the alumni? So there's about 5, to put that in practical terms, there's about 5 staff positions that we've not filled. And what we do now is we hire 100 alumni a year to do the work of 5 full-time staffers.
Wow.
So that's about 50 coaches, and it's about 50 recruiters. So all of the coaching at 4.0 has been essentially offshored or off-balance sheeted from staff to our alumni. And the reason we do that is because it's a way for us to model making 4.0 not a place where all the experts work and you come and you bathe in our wisdom. It's a community where the staff have this high bar of facilitating wisdom transfer between our alums and our fellows. And that's just an interim step, right? Where do we go with that in the future?
Yeah.
I think what that does, though, that these are moments, and I think the transition of CEO to Hassan is in that same vein, is that, I founded it, yes, but I've never gone through our programs. Hassan went through our programs twice. Aaron Walker went through our programs twice and then founded Camelback, which is a downstream fellowship where a lot of our alumni go after they complete both of our fellowships, and 40% of Camelback fellows are 4.0 alumni. Aaron is a 2-time alum, and he's now on the board. So Aaron's story of someone who goes through our program and then now is in board leadership over us is the story of Hassan being an alum who bombed twice. And that's a beautiful thing in our community, is that the CEO is someone who did some trials that didn't work. And so I think, what we're saying in all of this is, if you take seriously this idea of a future where families and students have a seat at the table, where they have power, it is incumbent on you to interrogate where power lives and try and redistribute it closer to them. And so they're just some interim steps that we are taking. And it's part of this larger question of what could 4.0 look like if it had no staff? What if all the assets were in the hands of our alumni and fellows? And so those are the questions that are animating this. And when we feel clear about it, we make that step. It's just a baby step. We need a new CEO. We need someone who is closer to the work, who's an alum, who's lived it. I can move on. I have dreams of applying back to 4.0. I don't know if they'll let me in the fellowship, but this is not me leaving the community. This is me saying this position of power that I hold, I want to share and give to someone else. And what happens, by the way, just under the hood of that, Hassan has been our COO. We're not replacing him as a COO in this transition. So this is another salary that goes off the books that now gives us that money to redistribute to alumni. So it's just another step in that journey
and
to move forward.
And I know you and Hassan both wrote some blog posts reflecting on the transition. I certainly encourage our listeners to read those blog posts and read about those reflections on power dynamics, on growth of an organization, and where our organization moves forward in the future. Hey, Matt, thank you so much for spending time with us today on our podcast and with our Teacher Leader Academy folks. We really do appreciate it.
It's a special community I've created, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Thank you.